So, good morning, everyone. This is my first reflection. This is an experiment, and like all experiments, it's bound to be a bit unusual, I think. There may be some surprises, some ups and some downs. I suspect, in fact, I believe I was told by the computer, there will be an MP4 file at the end of all of this that I hope to load into the announcements so that if you have the time, you can take a look at these. These, again, are just my reflections on the readings. I'll try to be succinct and clear at all times. I think that's my purpose here. If there are concepts, ideas, principles, assertions, what have you, that are not clear, that require further elucidation, that's why I'm here. So I wanted to say about the Dugan book, and I think I have his name right. We had 2 chapters to go through, and I'll do a reflection on chapter 2 as well as chapter 1, the one I'm doing now. And I'll continue to produce these reflections for each chapter of each book that we take a look at. Again, this is just by way of adding further elaboration, should you require it. You know, because I've mentioned to you that if you do have any difficulties in comprehending any of these notions, please let me know. Send me an email. We can talk. These ideas are quite complex. We will see, I think even today, we'll touch on ideology and hegemony, and those are very rich notions, very complex. We don't have to become scholars of these ideas, but we do have to gain sufficient clarity. That much is required so that we can apply them to our own personal and professional lives, which I think is our task here. We're reading theories, we're examining theories, but the whole point is to apply these theories. So let us get started without further ado. Now, I'm going to have to minimize my screen a bit because I want to call up some notes I have in Word. These notes are not important, so I'm not going to publish them. But they're notes on the readings. There are no surprises here. So without further ado, maybe we can get started. And I hope you can see me because I have my Word document over the screen. I would presume somehow you can see through that. If not, I'll minimize the Word document. So this is what I mean. This is experimental. I need a little time. So please bear with me. If you have any advice or suggestions, fire away. I'm all ears. So let's get started. Chapter 1. I want to just refer to the citation from Grace Lee Boggs. She was a feminist and activist in the United States. We are the leaders we have been waiting for. I mentioned this, I think, in our first meeting. This is where we're going. We're going to take a long trip through the theoretical literature on leadership and transformation. We'll talk about governance, but this is all by way of bringing it back to ourselves. I mentioned in our first meeting, leadership and transformation are 2 ideas that are coming at us like an express train, and there are reasons for it. And I want to talk about them just a little bit. First, let me point out what Dugan says in his chapter 1 at the very outset. He says leadership is ubiquitous. Now, that's a fancy word for everywhere. It's everywhere. There are discussions of leadership just about everywhere. So if you want to see a real illustration of this, take a trip to any major bookstore. Walk into the bookstore, go to the business section. There will be a business and management section, and just look at the number of books on leadership. You will see in a major bookstore at least a full shelf of texts books, many of them almost coffee table books on leadership. And moreover, there tends to be a certain common characteristic that describes these types of books. They tend to feature, I should say, heroic figures, often from the private sector, because as we all know, if anyone's innovative and creative, it must be the private sector. We'll come to the topic of ideology in a while. I'll park it for now. But you'll see a series of books on leadership. So leadership is very much under discussion at this point in time. And Dugan talks about the general context of leadership, but I think he leaves something out. And I wanted to add, this is by way of adding to Dugan. I'm not attempting a critical point here. I just want to supplement Dugan. I think Dugan overlooks, he mentions, he refers to Bennis, who's a management theorist, a very good one, as a matter of fact. And Bennis talks about a certain list, pretty short list of horrors. He mentions, as I recall, he mentions things like leadership problems that necessitate leadership. He talks about a critical space for leadership. But I think it's useful to bring in Ive here. If you remember Ive chapter 1, Ive talks about a whole range of crises. The ecological crisis, the political crisis, the financial crisis. And I think you're familiar with Ive, with that text. So you're familiar with the general context. The reason I bring the point up about Dugan here is I think what Dugan misses is what these crises impose in practical terms. Because I think what these crises mean in practical terms is that the world is becoming less stable, less regular, less predictable, and overall less manageable. If you see management, as I think most theorists do, if you see management as more or less a set of controls, so if you're managing something, you're exercising some form of control over it. Think of a bureaucracy. This is not that unusual a thought. If you think of a bureaucracy, what do you think of? Rules. Well, why are those rules there? Those rules are there to impose a measure of regularity, of rationality, of predictability, and of control, right? But if you have a world teetering on the verge of crisis, if the ground is shifting underneath us, if these challenges are coming at us at an alarming speed, there's nothing like a smooth and stable world. So in other words, it's very difficult to manage in a shifting, uncertain world. So Dugan says, this might be chapter 2 or chapter 1. He comes right out and says, you have to give up the notion of certainty. Now, we'll talk about that throughout our course. But all I want to say here is, I think Dugan, he left that out. So he cites a number of the horrors, as I said. He refers to Bennis. He talks about nuclear war and a number of other things, tribalism, but he doesn't connect it to leadership in a direct way. The fact of the matter is, when the world starts to tremble, your manager starts to become quite apprehensive, because the manager needs a world that can be regular enough, stable enough, so that controls can be applied. And by the way, when I say controls, that sounds like a very pejorative term. Oh, controls and controlling. And these are controls. If you've ever worked in your bureaucracy, you'll know just what I'm talking about. So you have, for instance, a whole series of financial controls. How do you spend? How much can you spend? Under what authorities can you spend? All of that type of infrastructure, you can put it that way, is related to these ideas. So let's go back to Dugin and carry on. And I'm sorry for my hesitation. So much for Dugin. Dugin says, these challenges necessitate the study of leadership, but that doesn't quite tell us what we need to know. What is it about these crises that make leadership now ubiquitous? And I think the answer I gave is part of it. Part of it is just that in this world, things are in fact less stable, less certain, less predictable, less regular, and less manageable. So I would add that to the Dugin. Let me go on to talk about the fact that, as Dugin says, leadership has no definition. Now, in a standard field, academic field, that would raise all sorts of concern. And I think I mentioned in our first meeting, I'm not going to trouble myself over a complete definition of leadership, a final definition of leadership. I'm not sure there's any point. We're going to look at theories of leadership, and we're going to examine them in some detail, look at their assumptions, provide some critical reflection, but we're not going to exalt any specific theory or any specific definition of leadership. That's a task best left to someone else with an awful lot of time on his or her hands. Now, I hope he uses the house metaphor in chapter 1, and I don't think there's any mystery there. All metaphors are somewhat limited in their utility when it comes to clarifying ideas, but I think it's clear enough. The notion of a house of foundations, a structure under the ground, a structure above the ground, the assumptions, the terminology, and what Dugin calls the core considerations of any given theory. So I don't think there are any particular surprises there in the way he shapes the relationship of a theory to his metaphor. I don't think there are any surprises. A pretty standard metaphor, in fact. Let me go on to, and if you have any questions about any of this, please let me know. Let's talk about his, he talks about research paradigms, and he mentions 4 of them. He mentions positivism, constructivism, critical theory, and postmodernism. Now, I'm not going to run through all of these. These are pretty complex nouns. Maybe I can put it that way. Like the notion of constructivism is a pretty rich idea. If you go into provide an analysis of it, you'd be spending quite a bit of time. There are a whole sea of implications behind it. The same thing is true of critical theory. Postmodernism is a general term that describes all sorts of currents in contemporary thought. It's very difficult to describe in any singular fashion. Positivism, I wanted to say something good about it because everyone says it's terrible. Positivism, first of all, Dugin says, I should look it up. Dugin says that the positivists, I thought it was interesting, and this is just a digression, no need to focus on this, but he talks about positivism and says the positivists believe in truths. And it's as if they believed in truths with a capital T. They're the old holdouts on absolute truth. They believe in truth with a capital T. And that, I think, is just wrong. It's not a big deal. Dugan's, it's a good book, but that's wrong, in my opinion. I hesitate to say wrong with a capital W, but it strikes me as wrong. The positivists held that all truths are contingent. There are no necessary truths, and there are no absolute truths. The positivists were scientists, so the positivist doctrine is very simple. It's this: a statement is meaningful if and only if it can be verified, where verification is looking into the world to substantiate whatever claim you make. So I say, the sun is out. Now, that's a statement about the world. Is it true? Well, I go to the window, I open the window, I look out, there's the sun. Aha. The statement, the sun is out, is true. That's a paradigm for the positivists. All meaningful statements must follow that pattern. Now, here's the problem with positivism. If you should like to refute it, here's one possibility for you. Think of the statement, all meaningful statements must be verifiable. Is that statement verifiable? Think about it. I'll let you reflect on that. I think the answer to that question is no, that statement's not verifiable. So by the criterion of verifiability, by the positivist criterion, the statement of positivism makes no sense. So they've created a theory that cannot speak its own name. I know that sounds strange, but in essence, the doctrine contradicts itself. It says only this type of statement can be meaningful, but this statement is not one of those statements. I hope you followed me. I don't want to go into the weeds there, but it's an interesting point about positivism. The social construction of leadership, I think, should be clear to us all. It's not a natural notion. There's nothing natural about leadership. The idea that we're born leaders is a very peculiar idea, suggesting, for instance, that we have a gene, a leadership gene. That's a very odd idea. It could be true, but it's got a long ways to go before it can secure any kind of serious attention. Leadership is values-based. I think, again, that point, I think it might be obvious enough for us. Leadership is interdisciplinary. I thought, and this is just my impression, so please do not take it to the bank, but read what he says about this, that leadership is interdisciplinary, because I think he confuses, or is at risk of confusing, leadership with the study of leadership. That's what hit me when I read that section. I thought, I think he's departing from his topic, leadership, and talking about the study of leadership. Not a big deal. Not a big deal at all. But I do think he goes off topic. Another point I wanted to make before I close this section and figure out whether this works is, and please forgive me for all of my hesitations. As I do this, I'll become somewhat more comfortable, I would hope. So what I wanted to say here, I wanted to say something about theory, because everyone worries about theory. Why are we looking at theory? What is theory? Well, I go back to the ancient Greeks. Theoria is an ancient Greek word. It means vision or sight. So I see a theory as little more than a way of looking at the world. And I would recommend that conception of theory, because people spend a lot of time talking about theory as if somewhere there were this perfect formulation of what a theory is, how we should define the term theory. And I think it's a bit of a false hope. I think we're looking for precision where precision might not belong. So a theory, again, it's enough to say a theory is just a way of looking at the world, coming to understand the world. Now, let me say something about a bit beyond what I've already said about theory that I think is important for people to understand. And that is that reality is underdetermined by theory and is always underdetermined by theory. That is to say, our theories never capture reality in perfect detail. I could give you countless examples of this, I think, but perhaps a good one, because we're all familiar with it, is the planetary, the model of the planets, the solar system. If you look at it, it assembles the planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and they go out and they spin around the sun. They revolve around the sun. And we have a picture of it, and it's a clean picture. The planets are staggered outward. And in fact, it's an inaccurate picture. For one thing, the planets, which are often pictured as revolving in circles, are ellipses. Well, we know that. Okay, so they're pretty close to circles, but they're not. That's one thing. The other thing is the planets wobble as they move around the sun. They wobble. Well, you don't see the wobbles in the planetary models, right? Now, why? Because models, theories, and here I'm using those two terms interchangeably. I might distinguish them later. But a model or a theory is a picture of the world that's never exact. So when we look at the model of the solar system, we don't see wobbles. We might, in some of the models, see ellipses, but in general, we see circles. And that's enough. That's enough. That's a good picture of the solar system. Is it perfect? No. Do we need a perfect one? No. We need one that satisfies, to use a term that Herbert Simon used, the engineer and savant, he used. It's good enough. So there's a further point I would make, and that is that theory requires abstraction and simplification. There are all sorts of things we're leaving out of that picture of the solar system, right? There are all sorts of realities that we're not taking account of, but we don't need to. It's enough to get the general picture so that it works for what we need to think through. So there's a very pragmatic dimension to theory. And in fact, Dugan talks in chapter 2, we'll get there, about Derrida and binaries, and binaries are good and bad, or there are a whole range of binaries. And one of the key binaries in our thinking is the binary between theory and practice, right? Or fact and value. These are binaries. So whatever is a fact cannot be a value, right? They're considered separate, distinct things. But in fact, if you reflect on the binary theory and practice, and here I'm going to refer to John Dewey, an American thinker of the 20th century, and others, Hilary Putnam is an example, another American thinker, who have challenged the whole binary of theory and practice. This idea that theoreticians go off and theorize, and other people go off and do practical things that somehow are connected to the theories, is not a very sound idea. If you've worked in a science organization, you would know, I think, or you would learn that theories are a way of doing. Theories are, if you walk into a science organization, you're not going to see any theories. What you're going to see is all sorts of instrumentation, experimental devices, people doing all sorts of things, technicians, engineers, and scientists. But what you won't find is somebody sitting in the corner doing theory. There are people who do theory. What I mean to say is they're not isolated from people who do practice, if the practical work, or however we want to put the practical side of science. So I just mean to bring the idea of theory back to earth. Another way of approaching this is to cite someone like George Box. George Box was one of the great statisticians of the 20th century. And he said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that's what we should keep in mind. We're presented with the idea that science is about truth with a capital T. And I don't think most scientists subscribe to that view. I think they believe in truth, but not truth with the capital T. I don't think they see their business as one of doing metaphysics or religion, right? Where you're talking about truth with the capital T. As I said earlier, for the positivists, truth is contingent truth. It's always subject to revision and change, right? There are no permanent truths. Now, let me go to box 1.2 on terms. I hope the terms were clear to you. If they're not, let me know, and we can discuss them. Again, you can send me an email at any time. I'm checking the time. I have no idea when I'll be timed out of this. So table 1.2 on terms. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I'm almost through what I have to say about chapter 1. Now, I think the most important thing he says in chapter 1, I'm glad I have time to get to it. And again, I apologize for jumping all over the place here. But on page 13, Dugan refers to Day's, and I don't know Day, the researcher. Day's distinction is simple but very important. And it is, and it's a very important distinction. And it's very important in the real world, in the world of organization development or community development. It's very important and very practical. The distinction is between leader development, where you take an individual and you work on his or her leadership, right? As opposed to leadership development considered as an effort to build the leadership of the organization and its teams or groups, right? So what you will find, and I worked in HR for years, I feel I can say this with some confidence. What you will find is there's a natural default in any discussion of leadership to individual leader development. So if you wave the flag and you say, we need leadership development around here, people will come to you almost as if by nature and say, well, I have a leader that might benefit from some leadership training. So there is an ingrained tendency to see leadership development as leader development. It's about individual leadership. And I think that's a terrible mistake. It's a terrible mistake. It's not a simple mistake we can overlook and disregard and forget about. It's a deep error. Most organizations require both leader development and leadership development. So just a little trip into my own professional experience just for a moment. I've found whenever I've raised leadership, and I've raised it all of the time, I'm told, well, again, we have these leaders we can put in a program. We can take our leaders and put them in a program. And that's the customary response. But often what you see in organizations is a breakdown, not at the level of the individual, but at the level of the group or the team. So I can think of an organization with 23 major figures, senior figures, who are called leaders in virtue of their occupying a senior role. So we all called them leaders without asking ourselves, so are they in fact leaders? We called them leaders because of their exalted positions in the organization. I think that was very clear. And when we talked about leadership development, we talked about each leader moving into a program to focus on his or her leadership. But that's not where the breakdown was at all. It was in the relationships among the leaders. It was the lack of any kind of team leadership, cohesion. There was no cohesion. There was very little collaboration. And yet all of these individuals, if you put a mirror in front of them, they all would have said, oh, I'm an outstanding leader. They might even have said about their peers, X is an outstanding leader. Y is an outstanding leader. But I'm here to tell you, for those of us who were depending upon their leadership, it was very clear that there was nothing like cohesion or collaboration. And this, if you've ever done executive development, this is par for the course. There's no surprise in it at all. So that I wanted to make that point because I think it's very important. There's a very important difference between leader development and leadership development. Most organizations, whether they're community organizations or public service organizations, require both. Dugan goes into some terms, leadership terms, capacity, enactment, motivation, efficacy. I didn't see any real difficulty there. If anyone has any questions there, let me know. He talks about a number of binaries near the back end, and one of them is management and leadership. We'll be talking a lot about that. He talks about growth and change. He talks about management as a necessary but not sufficient condition of transformation, of change, of handling change. And that, I think, would be true. If you move into transformation, if you're dealing with that level of change, you need to manage, but you'll never manage your way through it. You need to manage, but it's not sufficient. That's what Dugan is saying. You need to do it, but you need to do much more. It is not sufficient. I say that, and I'm emphatic about it, because an awful lot of leaders, when they face transformation, they turn to management, they turn to controls, they turn to a world without stability, the world of transformation, and they demand stability. They demand accountability. They demand governance at all levels to ensure accountability. And that's a way to strangle the free creativity that a leader needs to bring to the world of transformation. We'll be talking about all of that in the course of our studies. It's very difficult to isolate one of these ideas without bumping into the others. And one thing I would give Dugan credit for, he deserves credit for a number of things, but one is he avoids weeds. It's very easy to go into the weeds when you start talking about leadership, transformation, governance, because these topics are in fact very detailed, very rich, very complex. And it's very easy, therefore, to get lost. And I think Dugan does a pretty good job of keeping us on the straight and narrow. Now, I will every so often deviate from the straight and narrow where I think it's required. I talked a little bit about positivism today. It's neither here nor there. I just wanted to put in a good word for it because it's not a viable position, in my opinion, but it's an interesting one. So we should be careful not to be dismissive. Now, I think that might be, and here's the end of my test. I think that might be all I have to say on the first chapter. I'm just looking over this. We could talk about Kuhn for hours. Thomas Kuhn, he wrote the book in 1962, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Very provocative, wonderful book. Most thinkers, I think, reject his central thesis, but it, in an interesting way, it's a thesis about transformation. He's talking about transformation. His case is science. He's talking about scientific revolutions or scientific transformations. What he says about them is quite fascinating. But again, that would take us into the weeds, so I don't want to go that far astray. So I'm just looking over my notes. Have I forgotten anything? Perhaps I have. And let me conclude by saying, before I get cut off, I will work on these. They will get better. Please give me some time. And if you have any questions about anything that I've said, send me an email. Let me know. We can talk at any time. So with that said, I'm going to figure out how to stop the recording. Let me see. What do I do here? Stop the recording. Oh, there we go. There we go. I think I got it. Okay, hold on.